Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our next Ideas and Impact. I'm Carrie Slavens from South Island Prosperity Partnership, and we're very pleased to welcome you to another issue of Ideas and Impact. This morning we have Emily, our CEO, Emily de Rosenroll, in conversation with Christian Rangen. Christian is coming to us all the way from Norway, I believe, and they're going to talk about the blue economy and plans for the new Coast Centre for Vancouver Island. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the University of Victoria for their very generous sponsorship of this series. And to get us started, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kevin Hall, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Victoria. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to everybody tuning into today's event. So I'm Kevin Hall. I'm the new President and Vice Chancellor at the University of Victoria, and UVic's really proud today to sponsor today's conversation. It's part of an incredible series developed by the South Island Prosperity Partnership. Ideas and Impact really builds on SIPP's leadership and connects to big ideas and their potential impacts in the region. We're very proud to be an active and engaged partner in the region, and over the coming months, the university really looks forward to being a strong driver and a partner in the economic recovery in the region, and also really trying to change some of the social condition around the region. The pandemic's been really a destabilizer and a thing that's created unequal opportunities. In today's Ideas and Impacts, we're exploring Pacific Canada's massive opportunity in what will be a $1.5 trillion global blue economy. And we've just had a recent local surge to tap into that market by building our own ocean and marine hub here on the West Coast. COAST, as it's called, the Center for Ocean Applied Science and Technology, is a huge deal for this region in terms of diversifying and developing a really clean, innovation-based economy. As we know, Vancouver Island is home to a world-class ocean technology and marine businesses encompassing a wide range of activities in the blue economy. And we're also home to world-class education and research institutions such as the University of Victoria and also the Ocean Networks Canada. Every day at the University of Victoria, our world-class researchers are charting pathways to marine renewable energy, developing hybrid propulsion marine vessels, monitoring our ocean's health, and exploring how climate force changes are really affecting our marine ecosystem across Canada's 3 oceans. So I'm really looking forward to this morning's discussion and would like to now introduce you to our presenters. First, our moderator, Emily de Rosenroll. She's the CEO of the South Island Prosperity Partnership, as you know. She spearheaded a number of key economic development initiatives for the South Island, including the Rising Economy Task Force, the Smart Cities Initiative, and a number of Indigenous economic reconciliation projects. Emily was recently recognized as one of Business in Vancouver's 40 Under 40 recipients for 2020. Wow, I just remember when I was under 40. That was a long time ago, but congratulations, Emily. Our guest today is Christian Rangen from Engage, Innovate, and he's one of Europe's top strategy and innovation authorities. Latest projects include innovation superclusters, where countries explore large network innovation platforms. Christian's also spearheading X2 Inc., a program aiming to transport Norway away from its economic dependence on oil into new industries of the future. In the X2 ecosystem is X2 Labs, which has been referred to as one of the most ambitious entrepreneurship initiatives in the Nordics. So thanks again for joining us, and thank you to SIPP for providing UVic with the opportunity to partner on Ideas and Impact, and I'm really looking forward to it. So over to you, Emily.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. Wonderful introduction. And now, Christian, you and your company have worked with clusters from around the world, including the Norwegian Innovation Cluster Program, considered one of the leading cluster programs in Europe. You've also been instrumental in the founding of COAST, the Center of Ocean Applied Sustainable Technologies, which is a recently established alliance of BC-based ocean technology companies, both small and large. And with that in mind, we're going to start off with some questions and we're going to get right into it. I'm going to spend the first 25 minutes with questions between you and I, and then we're going to turn to the audience. So please, if you're part of the audience, please put those questions into the chat and we'll be engaging with you very shortly. So Christian, let's just start off with something very simple. What is a cluster and why does this concept lend itself to a modern economic development strategy?
Thank you, first of all, for the invitation, Emily, and Kevin and the SIPP. First of all, clusters are a natural phenomenon in the world of business. We've had clusters as long as we've had a world of business, going back to probably the Stone Age. One classic example is in Italy, where you have vineyards. If you have someone growing grapes, just naturally someone is going to emerge with the bottles and the labels and the corks and the marketing and the transportation and the distribution, and all of a sudden you have a value chain. But going beyond the value chain, you also have a collaborative ecosystem that is known as a cluster. Now, in the 80s, more and more people, including researchers at Harvard with Michael Porter, started looking at, can we build these? Are they just naturally emergent, or can they be built? And I think increasingly over the last 20 years, the answer is yes, absolutely. Given the right governance and structure and leadership, clusters can be built. So today, when we look at clusters, Emily, clusters are really collaboration platforms around creating new growth industries and new business opportunities. So a lot of the countries that I've worked with, they're actually developing clusters because they want to compete globally differently from what they've been doing in the past. There's a lot of research on the topic, but I think the most important thing is clusters exist to create new businesses and new industries. And we do it by collaborating, not only competing.
That's great. So, I mean, what's really interesting is how economies around the world are increasingly being really deliberate about the kind of growth that they want. And I think that what you're saying about clusters is really fascinating in terms of how we can actually augment, probably, where we have natural strengths already, probably not inventing, as you say. So thank you for that answer. My second question is, globally, the blue economy is growing extremely rapidly. And in fact, the OECD cites that it will be worth $3 trillion by 2030. So what's at play here, and what industries make up this market, and what's driving this sort of huge growth?
Yeah, so it's another key question. So one of the experts in clusters globally, he would always say, you're not competing with the city next door. So Victoria and you're not competing with Seattle. You're competing with Shanghai. You're competing with Melbourne. You're competing with Singapore. That's the first steps. When we look at the blue economy, I think that parts of Canada, at least, needs to really speed up, because if you go back maybe 50 years, a lot of the business was, localized. Today, every business is globalized. So on the Pacific coast of Canada, you have to sprint into global markets. One of my clients in Norway is currently closing big contracts on the west coast of the US around floating wind mills. And there's no reason in the world why this is not companies from the western parts of Canada. It doesn't make sense that you let Norwegian companies, thank you very much, come into your backyard and win in the emerging opportunities in the blue economy. So, what is the blue economy? Well, it is the traditional industries within the ocean space, so shipping and tourism and military and security and defense, but it's also a lot of these emerging opportunities. And I think that, from a Canadian perspective, we need to get going on those emerging opportunities much faster than what I'm seeing right now.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And what now do you think is driving the fastest growth? Right? One of the fastest growing sectors out there. What's really behind that in this moment in time?
Yeah. So it's always a combination of factors. But of course, the energy transition is a big deal, and more countries and companies are realizing that the resource extraction paradigm, whether you're land-based or sea-based, oil, sand, and offshore oil and gas, that is no longer a sustainable paradigm. So the transition is happening extremely quickly into offshore wind, offshore floating wind, and floating solar. Now, Emily, I don't know how many companies does Canada have in the offshore floating solar space, but I'll tell you, it should probably be more. Because when we are developing Norwegian companies in the floating solar space, they're not staying in Norway. they're sprinting to Singapore, they're sprinting to Malaysia, they're sprinting out to sort of claim their early footprints and their early market positions in these emerging opportunities. So I think on a global basis, sustainability, energy transition, creating new job opportunities, there's a lot of factors that give tailwind to the ocean industries. And like you mentioned in the opening with the numbers, there's significant economic opportunities for the countries and the regions that can seize them.
That's great. So we're talking about sustainability, new energy sources, new clean, high paying, innovative jobs. All this sounds good. What do you think, though, in British Columbia, in Pacific Canada? What are some of the strengths that you see here, the opportunities, and in particular for the South Island?
Yeah. So I mean, first of all, the strength that I see is beautiful skiing, great people, great food. But that's probably beyond the question. And second, I've really gotten to know the South Island, but I've never been there yet. So I'm really looking forward to getting a chance to. Yeah, I'm just going to get on my boat and start rowing. But more seriously, I think that we have to separate, and this is really important from a policy and leadership point of view, because any cluster initiative has to make a fundamental choice: grow, transform, or build. So that is a really fundamental choice that needs to be made early on. Should we be growing our existing industries in the ocean space? Question mark. Now that leads us into ferries and shipping. It leads us into tourism, and that could be the right focus. Or you can say we need to transform. So you may have ocean-based industries that just needs to be completely reworked. For example, oil and gas that we're doing a lot of work on. But what I think is most exciting, although it's always more of a long shot, is the build category. Because in the build category, you say, we do not have an industry for autonomous ocean solutions. We may have a couple of companies, but a couple of companies doesn't make an industry. But we believe that the global market opportunity for autonomous ocean solution is going to be so big that we're going to put like all hands on deck to build an industry that does not exist. So that is the fundamental choice. What are the kind of work we want to focus on? What do we want this cluster to achieve? Do we want to do the growing our existing industries? And that's pretty boring, actually, honestly. Do we want to transform our existing industries? Much more challenging. Or do we want to build entirely new industries? Much more difficult, but long-term, much more impact. So that's a fundamental choice that needs to be made in coming weeks and months.
So that's really interesting, because you also say that clusters can't be, invented or fabricated. So, I can't be, in an area in the Yukon and decide to invent, a winery cluster. That's a bad example, obviously, but you can't sort of start from nothing. So how do you actually, what's the formula? What's the recipe for building a brand new industry, out of thin air?
Well, first of all, I think you used the word fabricate, and that doesn't resonate. Second, it's never thin air. I mean, it's you guys have a lot of pieces, a lot of building blocks in the region, in the country, along the coastline, also going into the US. So there always has to be some sort of a foundation, some sort. But for example, I'll give you a story. So about 5 years ago now, I had a small role in the Norwegian solar energy cluster. And, honestly, except for today, there's never any sunshine in Norway. So why on earth would anybody start a solar energy cluster in Norway? Because obviously there's no sun, there's nobody does solar panels worth anything. So you must be stupid or visionary to do that. Well, she managed to get people on board to saying, the market isn't here. We're not talking about developing a solar energy market in Norway. That's tiny. What we're talking about is repositioning our existing capabilities and industries so we can win the big projects overseas. We want to develop solar energy in Africa. We want to develop solar energy in Arizona. We want to develop solar energy in Singapore. But we want to get the right industry players. We want to get the right policymakers. We want to build the go-to-market programs, the financing mechanism. We want to make sure that banks understand how to finance international solar parks, and got all of this stuff. So can we build a cluster anywhere in the world? You actually can. There has to be some sort of foundation, but it takes leadership to get the ball rolling and get people on board.
Yeah, no, I think that really resonates. And you did say we are repositioning existing industries, so you're not starting from scratch. But that's a good question. Two things you picked up on there: the ecosystem side to the cluster. So I'd love your thoughts on how important the ecosystem is, and what is. A lot of people maybe in the audience are used to hearing that in terms of the jungle or the natural habitat. So what is an ecosystem, and why is it important?
Yeah, good question. So we often talk about ecosystems and clusters in the same sentence. They are fundamentally different, but they're somewhat connected. So an ecosystem, the best example of an ecosystem is Silicon Valley. And you could probably say a lot of bad things about Silicon Valley, but Silicon Valley has a lot of different elements, building blocks. And when you put them together, they make out a thriving ecosystem. You have universities, you have financing companies, the venture capital companies that are investing in new companies. You have the big companies that are acquiring these small companies. You have a really risk-willing culture. And all of these things make up ecosystems. So for example, I've been working in Switzerland on ecosystem development, and it's been fantastic to see how the ecosystem has matured because, again, leadership, getting more talented people in, developing more accelerators, incubators, developing. I mean, in the Swiss ecosystem, and just in Zurich alone, they have more than 3,000 business angels actively investing and supporting startups. This is not something that happens by accident. It's something that develops. But the ecosystem is a more loosely defined jungle, if you will, while the cluster is a legal formal organization that has CEOs and board members, and they have meetings and minutes and budgets, and if you misbehave on Christmas party, somebody's actually going to slap you on the fingers. So there are structures and expectations with a cluster that you wouldn't normally find within a ecosystem. But both are important and they interact together.
Okay, and then to your other point that you picked up, the ecosystem is vital, and I think in the South Island we have a really thriving ecosystem. Lots of sort of cluster partners are already positioned and able to be leveraged to take this to the next level. So that's great. And then you mentioned also leadership. So I'd love your thoughts on leadership and maybe since this is a collaborative model, how does collaborative leadership actually work?
Yeah, great question again. So you mentioned in the opening the work that I've been fortunate enough to do with the Norwegian government. So I've had a chance to work with the Norwegian National Innovation Agency and the Norwegian National Cluster Program to basically reinvent and reposition. And one of the things that we found was that you couldn't apply traditional models of leadership into clusters because clusters are, very unique type of organization. It's a little bit like a soccer field and a football field. They both have green grass, but they're different. The rules are different, the players are different, the expectations are different, the way you score goals is different. So we found that within a cluster organization, you need much more influential leadership. You need much more connection and access to decision makers because you don't have formal authorities. You don't have a CEO with a lot of people underneath. You have a CEO with a lot of people above and outside. So successful leaders in clusters, they are really, really skilled communicator, negotiator, connector, influencers, but they never get a chance to make formal decisions like you would in a regular organization. And when we've studied, again, going back to the Norwegian example, when we studied the cluster leadership, it's very clear which type of leadership that makes it successful.
That's fascinating. I find that fascinating because would you agree that there's a real shift in terms of leadership models and what we aspire in terms of, what's the most effective leadership model, and how do we really incorporate, inclusion and diversity. And of course, that's a fundamental of building an ecosystem. We need to be building that in such a way that is inclusive. What, any tips for doing that? I'm sure you've seen it happen well, happen maybe not so well, fall off the rails and come back. Any sort of concrete stories about how things have not worked before?
Yeah, so one of the things that we see, so within a cluster, you typically have two really important roles to fill. One is the CEO that you typically look to, but there's also the chairman of the board. And what we find is that the chairman of the board needs to be able to really connect and influence the key people and get people on board, because the reality is that most business people, they don't really know what a cluster is. They don't really have time for this. So in our experience, the chairman of the board may need to have up to 3 to 4 meetings with each of the CEOs for each of the key member organizations. And if you have, let's say you have 20 key member organizations, that's 60 to 80 meetings trying to get people on board to understand what are we actually trying to build here. And that's, well, I don't have the patience for doing something like that, put it that way.
So patience is what we all need, and to exhibit more of. Okay, that's great. So Norway is a country with a population that's roughly the size of BC. It took decades to build the globally recognized ocean economy in your country that is now worth $110 billion, I believe. Of course, 70% of it or so is offshore gas, oil and gas. So, but tell us about how Norway did that, Norway's story and its evolution to become a blue economy leader, and what kind of lessons do you think we can learn from it?
That is a big question. It's also a great question. So, we probably should separate the oil and gas industry out of or at least to the side of the story a little bit, because a lot of the wealth that Norway has built has been, fortunately, thankfully, due to oil and gas. But we fully recognize, I think leaders here, industry and politicians have recognized for a long time that there is an end date to our oil and gas wealth. And whether that's onshore or offshore, there is an expiry date. Probably not because of supply, but more on the demand and the financial markets, the capital markets around the demand side. Mm-hmm. So for the last, 6 years, there's really been a national conversation, which I think is really important, on how do we transform as a country. And as a consequence, I think the Norwegian government, as well as companies and leaders and startups and investors, have really been able to tap into other areas and other sectors within the blue economy. And I was just wondering, Emily, am I able to share, would you mind if I shared one picture just to showcase?
Sure, we've got Kieran that can help you with that.
Wonderful. So I'm going to share, this is a super busy slide and nobody's supposed to read this. But as I was doing this, preparing for this conversation, in Norway, we have around 40 clusters, right around 40 clusters. Some are big and some are smaller. We have about 20, 25 ocean clusters. Here is a random selection of 13 of these ocean clusters. And it's really important because we're not talking about building one cluster in BC. I'm really curious to how do we build 10? And for many people, that may sound, preposterous. Like, well, why would we possibly need that? But the reality is, again, comparing the population and the size of Norway, comparing the population and the size of BC, I would not be surprised if we, a couple of years, maybe 5 years from now, are seeing a wide number of different clusters because they're different. So what you're seeing on the screen here is, for example, the one on the top, the GCE Ocean Technology Cluster. This is a fantastic cluster, but it's really an oil and gas and energy cluster. You go down one step, Blue Maritime, well, that's a shipping cluster. Those two are not the same. They shouldn't be mixed up too much. You go one step down, here we have the Maritime Cleantech cluster. Now that is a cluster completely dedicated to clean maritime solutions, batteries, autonomous systems, robotics. And they have more than 110 members that are actively trying to position Norway as the #1 country in the world for these clean maritime solutions. Now, as I go down this list, seafood, and then probably my favorite right now, which I go down here, this is the Ocean Autonomy Cluster. But notice they only have 45 members. It's a very new cluster. It's about 2 years old. But they are, when they show up for work every single day, trying to make Norway the leading country in the world for autonomous solutions in the global ocean industries. So as we talk about, the potential for BC, I think the potential is huge, huge. We could easily see a great number of different clusters, or maybe we're going to have like a hub and spoke model with different arms, because I think it's important that the ocean industries, the opportunity is so big, the technologies are very diverse, the markets are diverse, existing capabilities are diverse. So we may eventually, if you want to follow sort of the Norwegian model, realize that we may need many different ocean-based clusters. And here is just a snapshot that we could go into.
I think that slide is really helpful. Chris, we often talk about the sort of clusters and cluster focus and so on. And we're obviously, we've got a smaller market here, and this is a very mature market when you have this much specialization that's occurring, but we're getting there. And so I think that that's an important thing for us to consider as the, Greater Victoria's tech industry is the largest sector in our area. But of course, technology is vast and encompasses every single industry. So I think as we're going to see more and more over the next 5 years in particular, next couple of years even, so we're already seeing it, but so much more specialization occurring like this. So thank you for that slide. I have another question now.
Emily,
yeah.
if I can,
Sure.
you mentioned something that I think that I'm very passionate about, and that is the market. You said our market is much smaller.
Yeah.
That's such an important message, because these clusters, they don't serve their home markets. They're all export minded. So if any of these guys came to the Norwegian National Cluster Program and said, we want to develop a cluster for our tiny home market, they wouldn't even get in the door. They have to have very clear global markets and global market potential. So for example, all of our seafood clusters, it's not the Norwegians eating all the fish, yeah? It's the Japanese, it's the French, it's the Portuguese. So I think that the export gene that is built into these clusters is really important, because they're getting pushed to go find markets that are beyond, our sovereign region and sovereign waters.
Yeah, no, Chris, you're completely right. And I'm sorry, I should have said our population base, our labor market maybe is quite a bit smaller actually, but I'm not sure that I don't think anything that we're doing here is about not being an export market. Very good point. And I think sometimes something that probably limits a lot of vision. So important to bring that up. My next question is about, what do you think the environmental and climate change, issues that we hear so much about, of course, microplastic pollution, ocean acidification, increased issues with extreme weather, all of these kinds of things. That has a big impact on our oceans, but also, where do these issues fit in with regards to the blue economy and opportunities for the sector to also achieve global net zero targets? Like in Canada, our national target is by 2050.
I think that the whole conversation around sustainability and everything that follows is a really, really key moment. And we need to flip that conversation into, what's the market opportunities here? And I think some companies have been able to do it, and some regions, maybe even some countries have been able to do it, largely, maybe not everywhere. But if I take one specific example, so one of the large oil and gas engineering companies that I've been working with over the last couple of years, we ran a internal innovation project. It's a hackathon where we worked with about 100 and some employees to find new business opportunities. Like where could we go as a company? And one of the ideas that came up was ocean plastics. And that was about 2 years ago. And we weren't able to find, let's call it, a home within the organization. So nobody wanted to have that project because it wasn't really a business project. long story short, today this company has totally reinvented itself in terms of how it understands new sustainability practices and new sustainability business opportunities. So this company has now set up a number of different subsidiaries, and then they spin these subsidiaries out and they list it on the public stock market, and they're now raising billions to go after wind, hydrogen, to go after sort of ocean plastics and sustainability. So I think that as more and more business leaders and more capital markets really understand this, there's billions to be had, both from a value creation and also value capture point of view, if we find these business opportunities, because they're there. And now is a good time to get on them.
Fantastic. Okay. I love what you're saying about value creation. I think it ties to your previous point about also not limiting our ambition and thinking about the global market opportunity. So if we can solve a problem here, we can solve it for the world. Really good point. We've been talking a lot about common market opportunities with small and large organizations like BC Ferries, Babcock Canada, the Royal Canadian Navy. With such a diverse ecosystem, how do you think we go about finding a common focal point?
Yeah, can we skip that for now?
No,
I'm just kidding. That's a perfectly normal, and it's also a perfectly healthy part of any cluster shaping process. There's no one single good answer, but it has to emerge by conversations and collaborations, and maybe it takes a little bit of time. For example, again, if I look at this Norwegian solar energy cluster, they didn't know which markets they were going to go after when they first started, but they knew there was something there. And I'm quite okay with us saying for Victoria that we don't know exactly which markets we're pursuing, but we know that we need to get that clarified in the next months, weeks, better. But it can change. And then the more you learn, the more you will probably adjust to these emerging market opportunities.
fantastic.
That's my thinking.
Okay, that's great. And our region has demonstrated world caliber innovation, as you know, in the ocean space through SMEs like Marine Labs, Open Ocean Robotics, ASL Environmental, Barnacle Systems, Axis Technologies, and the list goes on and on. How do we help those companies scale into global markets?
Yeah,
and by the way, a lot of them are already scaling and they're in global markets, but how do we really accelerate that?
I mean, that is a great question again, Emily. And I just launched a online program. It's a complete self-service online program called Scale Up Coach. And the purpose behind this program is to train and equip and educate people to build scale-ups in their regions. Already we have people from 40 different countries going through this program. And one of the things that we realized was most ecosystems, most regions of the world, they have a strong focus on the startup stage. Like, we need to start more companies, and we need more young entrepreneurs, we need more students to start companies, and so on and so forth. But very few are good at the scaling stages. And there are three factors. Number one, you need access to capital, and we're talking, the tens of millions, maybe even the hundreds of millions. And that money has to come from private investors, or it has to come from capital markets. If you don't have the money, you can't scale. It's that easy. Number two, you need people with mindset and talent that sort of can take those steps, because the people that are starting a 2-man and a 3-man company, they're not the people that are scaling companies to thousands of employees. And number three, you need role models, people that have done this before. And I think that's what happened in Switzerland, I mentioned, because we were starting to see people that had been able to build a company, exit at a good price. So they had been through the journey, and now they could go back and do it again. But this time they had a roadmap. So, Julie Angus has really impressed me. The day she sells her company for 250 million, she's not going to buy an island. She's not going to buy a house. She's going to reinvest all of that money into new companies. And she has to go in and be a super angel to build the next generation. And we just need to make that generational cycle go much faster. So if she could exit that company in 3 years, and then she aims to help build 5 more and exit those in 3 years and do it again. So over a 10-year period, you now have a lot of those super angels. So that's a challenge for Julie right there.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more. I think that, you know, we've done a lot of research as well, and in this sort of space, and finding in one of the key identified issues in some of our areas in Canada, South Island included, it's the serial entrepreneurship, because of course that cycle, as you say, gets shorter and shorter and shorter, and the sort of the corporate knowledge, let's say, is retained even when the company is sold. So that's really critical. And we've seen that with some large companies that have been sold, and there's been, you know, 5 that have sprung up once the bigger one is sold. So it really is an ecosystem, and there's so many garden analogies that are possible here, but I'll spare you those analogies. So next, my last question here before we start taking questions from the audience, because I have a ton here coming in. Let's project out 10 years from now. Can you predict, you know, pretend you've got a crystal ball. How do we achieve our blue economy goals in the South Island? And how do you see our ocean and marine space, and indeed our city region? How will it look different than the way it looks now? And how will the world see us differently?
So I'd like to, you know, pivot your question just slightly. And this is something that we often do with clusters. So, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, but we do have scenarios. So when I work with cluster strategies, we often try to develop 3 scenarios. You know, what happens if we fail? What happens if we don't really deliver? And what happens if we outperform? And I think that we can apply the same framework here. So if we fail this, you know, Western Canada, Pacific Canada's ocean economy is gonna contract. It's going to be less people going through educational programs. Some of the big companies are going to get sold off, and there's not a new generation of companies coming in. More and more people are going to go into, you know, traditional land-based jobs, and you'll go on the boat in the weekends, and that's about it. But it basically shrinks. And people will say, well, I guess that was for the better because we all have good jobs anyway. The second scenario is, you know, and maybe the cluster is really, really influential, is you're able to make a couple of big leaps, and probably we're going to talk 1 or 2 sectors. So 10 years from now, you know, you have the sector, let's call it ocean robotics, or maybe shipping. And those sectors have really benefited. New companies have come in, some degree of capital has come in, maybe the university that opened has started a couple of new programs. But, you know, let's be honest, it's not that much, but it's a little bit. But if we look at this outperform scenario, and that's what I think is really interesting here, you know, what would a really success story look like? And you start mapping that out. Well, your friends in the digital innovation cluster, I mean, just across the water, they suggest that they have helped create more than 20,000 new jobs within the digital economy. And, you know, we can always argue what kind of data is underneath that, but there's no doubt that successful clusters can generate a massive impact. And I think that the outperform scenario, if we develop that, is going to show us, you know, technology leaps. It's going to show us a completely different attitude when we're talking about go to global markets. We're probably going to have to set up international go-to-market offices in Japan, 2 places in China, Singapore, because that's your market region from an ocean point of view. And then finally, I think that we're going to be looking at a range of startups that we're able to scale, attract financing, and really grow successfully. So, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, but we do have scenarios. So one is contracting, one is like pretty linear, boring, and the second is really outperforming. And I think that is a part of the cluster work to develop more in detail.
Okay, Chris. The one thing, you know, from working with you already, my favorite thing about you is how candid you are. And so you didn't give us, you gave us a pretty raw answer. And I think that's something that's important for us to really conceive of, is that, and people don't talk about it as much as they should, that the fact is, if there is, there's growth, there's plateauing, but there's also the very real chance of contraction of our economy. And especially in this area where we have rapidly rising unaffordability, some other issues that are, barriers, they really can constrain the opportunity, the sort of replenishing of next generation jobs, or the new jobs to replace the old ones. And it's something that very much is going to be, I think, a real burning platform for us in our community to start really wrapping our head around. Okay, now I'm going.
Emily, can I mention just one quick comment on that before we go through the questions?
Mm-hmm.
Good boards. So you talk about a cluster organization, you have a board, and you can have between maybe 10 people, maybe 20 people. But good boards and good board members, when they show up, they don't represent their companies. They don't sit there and say, I represent company A, B, or C. They say, I show up and I bring my company, my resources, and my network, and my talent, and my brain, but I represent the larger industry as a whole. And those good boards, when they really work, they do really, really, really high impact work. But if they show up with this sort of a transactional approach, what's in it for my company, it's never going to work. They can just go home.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Again, a really important point, especially when we're talking about building an industry or cluster. Self-interest, or it sort of is part of the bigger picture. You'll experience growth if the environment is healthy and growing and so on, but it can't be a direct what's in it for me question. So thank you for that. So now I have a question from the interim CEO of Coast, Craig Norris, who's currently the CEO of the Victoria International Marina. So he asks you, is there a primary pitfall in cluster success that we should be watching out for?
There's a long list. I mean, wow. Yes, two major pitfalls. Number one, not getting commitments from the key people in the ecosystem. So this is where it kind of gets difficult, because company CEOs have to lean into this. The heads of the universities have to lean into this. If they send people like 5 levels down, forget about it, not even worth showing up. So I think that the number one pitfall is, do you have commitment from the key people, yes or no? And then once you have the commitment, do you have financing? Because if you don't have commitment, you don't have financing, this is not going to happen. And that can be difficult, because again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, most business leaders are busy. They don't have time for this. They don't fully grasp what it is and what opportunities it has. So a lot of people go like, yeah, sounds interesting. I don't get it. Bye-bye. And it's done. So getting commitment and getting financing, that's the two biggest ones earlier.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I'm sure Craig will be scribbling notes down. I think he'll appreciate that answer. Great, thank you. Peter Elkins, he has a question for you. Christian, can you please speak to venture studios versus incubators to speed up the process of getting to innovation, or getting innovation to companies that are able to sprint globally as fast as possible? And are you seeing more venture studios than incubators in forward-leading countries?
Yeah. Great question. I mean, that question could be debated in depth. Different countries have different interpretations. So I think we should take a step back and define them. So we define incubators as a place where companies come in and meet and work, and they get some basic support, but the level of engagement is not really that strong. But companies are gently being incubated, if you want to use that. The gardening approach. Venture studios is different. Companies are getting built and companies are getting pushed, and people that are in the venture studios typically have equity, so they now have a stake in the companies. They want to see this, go. So if I could choose, I would like to just sprinkle all of BC with venture studios and close down the incubators, because from a ROI point of view, I would say that the venture studios are much more valuable. But then again, we can be more diplomatic and say we need both, because the venture studios tend to come earlier and the incubators a little bit later. But I think one tend to be publicly financed incubators, publicly also including universities. while the venture studios tend to have more of a commercial approach. So I like that one better if I could choose, but it's a good question.
Okay, and I'm just to add to that, there's also some models that are a little bit different than that as well, where you're really focusing on aggregating customer demand and really having a customer focus. Some of those are, like Can Healthy or Edge Network in Canada. What are your thoughts on that kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, most innovation and also for most startups and scale-ups, you really want to make sure that you're solving a genuine customer problem and genuine market problem. So over the last decade plus, a lot of programs have sprung up that are really problem focused. And that allows us to bring in big companies. They have problems, and supposedly you bring in small companies that can help solve those problems. Sometimes they work and they work really well. Sometimes they don't really meet expectations because of various reasons. But I think it's a great approach. And if you get it right, it can have a really good impact.
Okay, great. Another question from the audience. What do you see as the government's role in helping grow clusters?
Different countries, different approaches. In Iceland, the government has no stake whatsoever. Clusters are completely privately financed and they have to carry on by themselves. That may be changing, but that's been the approach. Australia, same thing. Government doesn't have a stake, doesn't have a role. Governments have other policies and other programs, but not clusters. You go to, for example, Austria, government will support the clusters early on, but then gradually over a 10-year period, they'll sort of phase out and say, you're on your own. I think largely governments should have a very big role early on, and then over typically a 10-year period, they should phase out. And that's also what Canada is doing with the supercluster program. First, they said, we're going to support you for 5 years. You're on your own. Oh, that was too short a timeline. Now it's going to be 10 years. But governments really, really matter. And I haven't seen a successful national or regional program that didn't have strong government leadership.
Okay, great. Here's a question. We are on the verge of creating 133,000 square kilometer marine protected area off our coast that does not consider any offshore energy projects. Any sort of thoughts on that gap?
Well, I may have misunderstood the question, but if I try to understand the question better, you're setting up this marine protection area. That's a good thing. Then you have, what are the opportunities for offshore energy? But I think the offshore energy opportunities doesn't have to be in Canada. I mean, it can be in the US, it can be in Alaska, it can be in China, it can be in Japan, it can be in Mexico. When we look at a map, you guys are sitting in this beautiful big blue part of the global map, and you have all of this market and all of these countries in front of you just waiting to be served. So, from BC, look out and see that global market and the Asian market in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another one, there's so many questions here. They're great questions. How can we encourage companies with existing safe business models to, actively engage, at an early stage to explore becoming involved in less certain, riskier, let's say, technologies that will help accelerate their development? What are your thoughts on encouraging them to do that?
Yeah, I remember some years ago, and it was early in sort of Norway's transformation story. We were hosting an event and the Prime Minister showed up. And one of the startups that was speaking was giving a presentation how she had started a drone company. And the first question the Prime Minister asked, so let me see if I got this right. The Prime Minister said, so you left a safe job in the oil and gas industry to go start a drone startup? And, we kind of raised our hands and said, there are no safe jobs in the oil and gas industry. That's the biggest hoax ever. Back to what you said, I don't think there's a single company in the world that can say that we have a safe and bulletproof business model. So any smart company today will build a portfolio where you have a majority business model, which is relatively safe for the moment, but you need to build out your new, what we call growth and explore business models at the same time. And I think most companies, including the ocean space, need to be much faster in building out these new opportunities much more aggressively than we have in the past.
And I think we've all seen with the pandemic how much, you know, a lot of what we thought were safe business models have been completely disrupted, and the sort of push to adopt technologies and innovations has been massively accelerated. Great. So another question here from Robin Quinn. What is a proven approach to provide a voice to smaller and more nimble companies in a cluster when there are big players who have maybe more influence?
Yeah, good question. Very important question. So different clusters tend to have different, you know, personalities almost. And the good ones, they have multiple startups on the board. So when I look at the cluster board, and if there's no startups or scale-ups, early stage founders, you know, we have to try to fix that. Second, every cluster would typically have what we call an innovation group or a working group around the startups and scale-ups. So you would tend to aggregate all of these tiny companies so they get a much bigger voice. But for most clusters, it is a process. But we've seen so many good examples and so many good stories over the last 5 to 10 years of how clusters help catch up and support and accelerate companies of any size.
Great, that was good. Very important question. I agree. I've got another question here from Jeff Wilmhurst, the VP of External Relations at Camosun College. And he asks, how can applied post-secondary institutions with strong technology and trades programming like Camosun best support a cluster such as this one?
Yeah, you know, that's a conversation I would love to have beyond the minute I have to answer. So any good cluster would typically have talent management or people development as one of their pillars and one of their areas. So when we talk about, you know, the BC and Victoria region, we say, how can the cluster and industry and academia collaborate better? And we would look at, you know, what kind of programs do we have at the bachelor level? What kind of programs do we have at the master's level, executive level, MBA level, and PhD level? Where are the gaps? And what we really like to see is that we, within the first few months, establish an executive MBA called Ocean Industries or Ocean Opportunities. And that MBA program is being run by, you know, a local school, whether it's a technical school or a business school. And then the participants are the key members in the cluster. And also many of the speakers are the key members in the cluster. But I would like to invite you and challenge you you should have that program up and running with students in the classroom by August this year. Not next year, but this year. That's the kind of timelines that we're used to seeing in clusters that work really well.
That's a great call to action. Okay, I'm sure Jeff will pick you up on the offer to have a chat one-on-one after. Great. Okay, the next question, this is interesting, from Chad Hyde. I'm a foreign direct investment officer with Canada Trade Commissioner Service, covering the ocean technology sector. What role do you see for foreign companies participating in the Ocean Hub cluster and ecosystem that you're discussing today?
No, fantastic question. I love that question. So Emily, previously I mentioned this Norwegian Ocean Autonomy cluster. So they have 45 members. The cluster CEO is Norwegian, but he has members from Canada. He has members from the US. He has members from Asia, because of course he does. So when we're building this in Victoria, I think that we should have a goal year number 1, 10% international companies. Year number 2, 20%. Year number 5, 50% international companies. That would be really, really bold, but it would not be unheard of.
That's a good call to action. Another one. I think we've gotten a lot of targets from you today. That's great. Okay, I do have a sort of a question that a little bit relates to this. This is coming from actually an anonymous attendee. So I'll just tell you the question. What is the right scale for the cluster? Is this going to be limited in your mind to Greater Victoria, the Vancouver Island level, or the Pacific Northwest? And so they want to understand, how do other regions outside of the island play a part in this?
Yeah. There typically are 3 types of clusters. And Emily, we talked about this in the past. So the first is the emerging cluster, and the emerging clusters are typically quite young. They're quite small, understaffed, underfunded, and very local. So that cluster would probably be the South Island. It may even be, downtown Victoria. And that's the starting point, but it's not the goal. The second stage, the second type are what we call growth clusters. And a growth cluster, bigger, has a bigger outlook, and it would just naturally have members from all over Canada because it makes sense. And you may also have some members from the US. You may also have some members from Norway because it just makes sense. But then when you get to the third stage, the really advanced and mature clusters, you would just naturally have global members because it just makes sense. And that can be your business partners in Japan. It can be our technology suppliers in China, but these would just perfectly fit in. And that just makes sense. But it is an evolutionary approach. It takes a little bit of time.
Okay, good tips as well. I've got a question here now from Jim Hayhurst, and it's also a provocative question, which we expect from Jim. Looking at successful clusters is always helpful, but what about the failures? So what is the major factor that prevents a potential filled region like Victoria from developing? In other words, what are the things that we need to be aware of and to avoid at all costs?
Yeah, I'll answer that question in two parts. But first, Emily, I just have to mention this. This is so cool. So my mom is watching this webinar from Norway, but she was up at 9 o'clock this morning because she thought it was 9 o'clock in the wrong time zone. But she's in Norway and she's watching this cluster. I have people all along the Norwegian coastline really curious to see what happens and sort of how we can connect and collaborate. I have many cluster managers from Norway that want to collaborate with you guys once you get this thing going. Now, in terms of the sort of, the debt cycles and the risks, obviously those exist. So it's dangerous to put all your eggs in one basket and say, this is one cluster and it's the only cluster and it's the best cluster. And by the way, we don't have any other clusters. So one of the things that with the Norwegian model is that we fund a lot of small clusters, but if they don't perform, we exit and close down. So there's a much more entrepreneurial mechanism. And if the cluster over a 2-year period don't meet certain targets, politely we shake hands and kill them. So I think that by putting all the eggs into this one cluster basket here, we just have to make it succeed. Now, why do they fail? It's typically by not having member engagement. It's not finding markets opportunities. So it becomes more of a conversational, like we have a lot of meetups, but there's no business, there's no markets, they die. And the third one is that we don't really find a good financing model, which is always challenging. So not getting members, not finding markets, and not finding money, those will kill any cluster.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Great. And I would like to say thank you to your mother for joining us from Norway. That's fantastic. My mother often joins these as well. My next question is coming from John Trelevin. Since only customers create jobs, good point. Yes, that can be argued that only customers can create a sustainable cluster. Do you agree with that statement?
No, I don't. I agree with the first part. And any cluster, and I'm really passionate about this, you need to figure out who are the customers, both the present and the future customer of this cluster. And you want to try to bring the customers into the cluster. But if you have too many customers inside the cluster, it gets a little bit messed up. So you want to be very clear on where are the customers, and then you want to figure out exactly what does the cluster structure look like. But you need to have the customers on the map, because those are the ones that's going to pay this one way or the other.
Okay, great. Well, I can't believe it. We're out of time. This raced by. We still have lots of questions here, so we might have to invite you back for a follow-up, Chris, maybe in August, and we'll have to tell you how much we've progressed by that point. So for now, I would like to thank the audience first and foremost for tuning in and for such wonderful, thought-provoking questions. And thank you, of course, to Christian Rangen from Engage and Innovate. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm looking forward to continuing that conversation and continuing to find ways to collaborate with you and your network. So thanks finally to the University of Victoria for your generous sponsorship. That's the third sponsorship of Ideas and Impact, bringing really important conversations to the community. And so we're grateful for their contribution. Stay tuned for more announcements about the spring and summer sessions of Ideas and Impact. And last, thanks on behalf of South Island Prosperity Partnerships team for being with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day.